Sinclair Research Limited. A name that may not mean a whole heck of a lot to people outside of the UK, but in the UK, many are quite familiar with this company, as for a time, they were on the top of the world when it came to computer technology, well, in the UK. Their international success is a bit mixed, but within the United Kingdom, they were a pretty big deal, and it was all spearheaded by one man, Clive Sinclair. Some of you may remember that I just talked about all this when I talked about his invention, the C5, electric vehicle that didn't do so hot, but I mentioned that I would be willing and wanting to talk about the entirety of Sinclair Research, and many of you agreed with that assessment. And you might be saying, didn't you just do that video? How are you putting these out so fast? Well, I can tell you that in this case, I was, expecting most of you to want me to talk about this when I said it, so I've already done most of the work, to actually do this video, hence why it is so quick. Anyway, Clive Sinclair, or should I say Sir Clive Sinclair, as he did receive a knighthood, was an English entrepreneur and inventor. And his story doesn't begin with Sinclair Research Limited. It starts with a separate company known as Sinclair Radionics, also founded by him. Now, Sir Clive was always a big tinkerer and inventor. He was a smart guy, very inquisitive, and he wanted to start his own company to sell his own inventions. But he didn't have the capital at the time. He first started out writing articles for Practical Wireless magazine. And even when he founded Sinclair Radionics, he did most of the work on his own in the evenings while he continued working for Practical Wireless. And his focus was on small electronic devices, little gadgets and doohickeys, not full-tilt computers, at least not at the time. Their first product was the Sinclair microamplifier. It hit retail in December of 1962. Just the following year, they released their first full-tilt radio, with the Sinclair Slimline, in kit form at just 49 shillings and 6 pence, which might mean not a lot to most of you. It was £2.47 and a half. They produced several other amplifiers and radios, but they also started producing calculators. This was first explored in 1972, the first of which was known as the Executive. And the Executive was interesting because not only did it have a pretty decent battery life at the time, but it was also much smaller than calculators that were being made by competitors. That made them a very attractive buy. It used hearing aid-sized batteries. This was possible because they had figured out that there was considerable latency in the display, as well as the memory. So, if they added a timer, power could be withheld from those components for, well, most of the time, which boosted the longevity of the batteries. Sinclair got pretty focused on calculators throughout the 1970s, trying to create the most affordable one with the best design. They would also release the Sinclair Cambridge, which was a much cheaper alternative to the Executive. The Executive was around £80, but the Cambridge was only $30. And in 1975, they also released the Sinclair Scientific, which was, as the name suggests, a scientific calculator that retailed for about £50. I could go on and on and on, but the calculators did pretty well for them at least for a while, but towards the end of the 70s, things started taking a downturn. Some of the products they were making were definitely interesting, but just weren't sellable. No one was really buying them. A big case for this was the Sinclair Blackwatch, which kinda looks like a modern smartwatch if it was missing like 2/3 of the screen. It was a digital watch that retailed for about £18 in kit form and 25 ready-built. It was introduced in 1975, but not actually available till 1976. Unfortunately, the Blackwatch was full of problems, just so many. It really wasn't a good watch in any way. For one thing, it only had a battery life of about 10 days, which for a watch is horrid. How often do you change your watch's battery? Be honest with me. And I'm not talking about a modern smartwatch, I'm talking about a regular watch. You probably don't change it for months at the least. 10 days was completely unreasonable, and they weren't even easy to replace. The quartz crystal display was also temperature sensitive, which meant that the watch could run at different speeds according to the ambient temperature. So it couldn't even tell time when it was running. If all that wasn't bad enough, The LED display brightness was pretty bad, so it was hard to see in certain lighting environments, and the case switches weren't reliable, neither were the clips that were intended to hold the plastic case together. It was a complete disaster for Sinclair Radionics. They had spent a ton of money on R&D, as well as production, and basically no one was buying them, and many of the watches were returned for either replacement or a refund. It was so bad that they would have gone bankrupt if the government hadn't stepped in. See, at the time, underneath the Labour government of Harold Wilson, there was a part of the UK government known as the National Enterprise Board, or NEB. The board was put together in order to support the government's interventionist approach to industry. Basically, the government had a lot more power to just put their hands in all sorts of parts of the economy. Rather than letting the free market run itself, it was a lot more socialist and possibly communist in that way. The NEB didn't last particularly long because in 1981, the Conservative government under Margaret Thatcher combined the NEB with the National Research Development Corporation to form the British Technology Group, or BTG Limited. Regardless, the NEB put a significant amount of money into Radionics in order to keep them afloat, and that meant they had a 43% stake in the company. By 1977, they had increased the stake to 73%, therefore having a significant amount of say in what the company was going to do. Sinclair didn't really care for this particular situation they found themselves in, but he already planned an exit strategy. He resigned in July of 1979 with a £10,000 golden handshake, as they sometimes call it. Sinclair would also encourage Chris Curry to leave Radionics to help get his new company operational. Sinclair had already purchased a shelf company known as Able Steel Limited in September of 1973. Eventually, that name would be changed to Sinclair Instrument Limited. Their first product was a watch-like wrist calculator that was mostly put together to generate capital so they could make bigger stuff. In July of 1977, Sinclair Instrument Limited changed their name again to Science of Cambridge Limited. Around the time of this name switch-up, Ian Williamson showed Chris Curry a prototype microcomputer. A microcomputer is a small, relatively inexpensive computer, having a CPU made out of a microprocessor. They would become pretty popular, and Curry thought it was really cool. He was impressed, so he encouraged Sinclair to adopt it as a product. This particular computer was based off of the National Semiconductor SCMP microprocessor. Sinclair would agree to this, and they started selling what they called the MK14, or Microcomputer Kit 14. It was a kit for a microcomputer, not a pre-built one, that retailed in 1977 for about £40, and they sold quite well, mostly owing to the price. It was basically impossible to get a computer for £40, like, that's it? Mind you, that's only $430 in today's American money. It's a completely reasonable price for what you were getting. True, you had to put it together yourself, but these kind of kits gave people much needed experience in handling computers and their components. It was interesting, but they weren't done yet. They pushed forward on developing a similar sort of offering, and in May of 1979, Sinclair's chief engineer, whose name was Jim Westwood, designed a brand new microcomputer that was based on the Zilog Z80 microprocessor. This new offering would be put up for sale as the ZX80 in February of 1980, both as a kit and ready-built, so you could get this one pre-assembled if you wanted to. Now, the Z80 tends to get overshadowed by a few of its follow-ups, but it paved the way for what Sinclair would really wind up being known for. So the thing about the ZX80 was this: it was only £100. That's it. $741 in today's money. For the time, this was a ridiculously cheap computer for what you were getting. They got around a lot of expenses that plenty of other manufacturers had to absorb. For example, it didn't have a screen. It worked much like a game console, in that you plugged it into a TV and used that as the screen. It was exceedingly minimal, but it was a workable, upgradable computer. A basic thing that opened up the door for a lot of people who, didn't really know anything about computers to start messing about with them.
The computer Computer, 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 yip.
Granted, it wasn't perfect. This first outing was criticized in a few ways. The screen had a habit of blanking out during program execution, so that was neato. The RAM size was basically non-existent, but that's what you pay for. And the keyboard was trash. Man, that keyboard is awful, even for the time. Because instead of proper keys, it used kind of a membrane touch interface. You could probably tell looking at the pictures how this worked, and yeah, it was a pain to type on. Not really good at all for lengthy word processing, you know, but that wasn't really the point. They were offering a very, very cheap computer that was affordable to regular consumers. And that was good enough. It sold roughly 100,000 units, so not bad, but they were busily working on the successor to this. By this point, they had changed the company name again to what you probably know them as, Sinclair Research. And on March 5th, 1981, they released the follow-up to the ZX80, the ZX81. I see what you did there. That's clever. And while they had saw some limited success with the ZX80, the ZX81 smashed it. By the end of the production, they had sold more than 1.5 million units of the ZX81, mostly because while it was very similar to the ZX80, they did make it a point to fix a handful of the flaws, not the keyboard still sucked, but also it was even cheaper. The ZX81 retailed for £50. That was it in kit form, 70 assembled. And many historians point to the ZX81 as the point when computing in Britain became something that the general public was able to do, rather than something exclusively reserved for businessmen and electronics hobbyists. Everybody could get a hold of a ZX81 and start messing about with computers. It brought computers to people that had never even considered getting one before, and showed them what they could do, both in terms of practical uses as well as video games, because believe me, we're about to get to video games. In any event though, the ZX81 would lead to what is, by and large, the most famous product that Sinclair ever created. Of course, I'm referring to the Sinclair ZX Spectrum. Oh yeah, rainbows. Releasing in the UK on April 23rd, 1982, the Spectrum was something, but something good in pretty much every conceivable way. It is considered by and large to be one of the most influential computers ever made. It was like the other ones, but better, much more capable. It retailed for £125, so still very affordable, but what you were getting for that price was a heck of a lot. The thing about the Spectrum, and honestly the precursors to it, was that it was designed to be the most basic it could be, but have a lot of options for upgrading. It was an 8-bit home computer, and the attractive aesthetic of the Spectrum can be credited to Rick Dickinson, a British industrial designer who had been hired by Sinclair to design the ZX81 as well. He was tasked with creating something that was very marketable, very sleek, and yeah, no, you nailed it. You got that one down. Good work. The Spectrum offered significant improvements over pretty much everything that came before it. The keyboard was even a little bit better. Not very good still, it was still pretty bad, but much better than it had been. And in the end, a total of 5 million ZX Spectrums would be sold. People loved the thing, even to this day, and it's mostly centered around the realm of gaming. Now, not everyone used the Spectrum for that, but the Spectrum had a ton of video games, and many gamers that grew up in the 80s may have had or at least seen a Spectrum, and played many of the classics available for it. And I'm sure some of you want to see these games, these awesome, amazing, cutting-edge games, utilizing all the technical ability that the 1980s can surmount. Behold, the unspeakable power of the ZX Spectrum! I was hoping it would be a little more dramatic than that. Yeah, so, the games are great for their time. See, you're probably laughing at this, but you kids, you dang kids with your 4Ks and your 120 FPSs, you're so adorable. We didn't have this option, okay? We didn't have this fancy nonsense. We got like 12 pixels to work with here, and there were a lot of really fun games on the Spectrum. Yeah, sure, it's dated by today's standards, but it was the 1980s, come on now. And the Spectrum is home to many a person's favorite video games. People loved gaming on the Spectrum. It was one of the things it was best at. And even when other computers came along and offered better graphics and things like that, at the end of the day, a lot of people still stuck with the Spectrum. The Spectrum itself would also gain several upgrades, like the Spectrum Plus and the Spectrum 128. It was a tremendously successful device no matter how you slice it, with a ton of different peripherals, games on tape. Yeah, I bet some of you are confused by that. But yes, you can, in fact, put a video game on a cassette, like we use for music, and play it that way. Also, you have to rewind it. I know it sounds friggin' weird, but it does work. And a lot of games were sold via cassette because it was the cheapest option. Spectrum software was, indeed, almost exclusively on audio cassettes. Go figure. But either way, it netted Sinclair Research just so much money. It was such a tremendous success that people hoped for the next best thing. As I mentioned, they did put out some upgrades for the Spectrum, but they also were working on something to, well, not necessarily replace it in Sinclair's mind, but complement it. One of the problems the Spectrum had was that it really couldn't make much headway outside of the UK. There were a few areas of the world where it did alright, but one area where it didn't was in America. They had wanted to break into America, and they worked with the Timex Corporation on that particular venture, as they had obtained a license to manufacture and market Sinclair computers in the USA, under the name Timex Sinclair. For example, a version of the ZX81 was sold over here as the TS1000. But the thing was, no matter what Timex seemed to do, the computers just didn't sell well over in America for whatever reason. The market was a bit different, more upscale. True, they were very affordable, but American consumers seemed to have more money and wanted something more. Also, a lot of these computers were being used for gaming, and America was going through a video game crash, where consoles and arcades were taking a nasty hit. There just weren't many people interested in getting them as a game machine, and as a business PC, they really weren't so good because of that crappy keyboard. So that really hurt sales in general. But that was fine. They were still doing fantastic in the UK, as long as they continued to make a quality product. And then they released the Sinclair QL. And that was a really bad idea. Well, okay, it wasn't a bad idea, but man, did this not go well. The QL stood for Quantum Leap. Fancy. And it is a personal computer that was launched by Sinclair Research in 1984, and it was meant to be the upper-end counterpart to the Spectrum. This model was not intended to replace the Spectrum so much as offer something more for the business side of the industry. Sinclair realized that most businessmen weren't investing in a Spectrum because the Spectrum wasn't really meant for them. The keyboard wasn't good for their purposes. The QL was meant to be Sinclair's step into that field, and it did awfully. They only sold 150,000 units, which is a pittance compared to the Spectrum, and it was for a lot of reasons. Most because, especially early on, the QLs were kind of pieces of junk. To begin with, they had launched the QL well in advance of it actually being ready. They rushed it, and offered it through mail order by January 12th, 1984, but mind you, by that particular date, even though it was on offer, people could buy it, there was no complete working prototype in existence? Wait. You guys put this thing on sale, and it isn't even working yet? You don't even have a prototype? What are you doing? They promised delivery within 28 days, but that never happened. The earliest people ever got them was in April, and that provoked significant inquiry from the Advertising Standards Authority, a self-regulatory organization of the advertising industry in the United Kingdom. Basically, they make sure that you're not falsely advertising anything. And if you say you have this thing on offer and it isn't actually finished, yeah, that kind of looks bad. Naturally, because they didn't have a working prototype before they started selling it, they didn't work out a lot of the kinks. Early production QLs were shipped with preliminary versions of the firmware, which wasn't ironed out. A ton of the super basic code needed to be worked on, and they just didn't actually take the time to fix that because they had already started selling the stupid things. But even worse than that, a big chunk of the firmware was held on an external ROM cartridge, because the other QLs couldn't accommodate the additional ROM, so they had to plug this in separately? What? That's ridiculous! and the QLs had significant problems dealing with the microdrives. This was fixed eventually, but the early ones were garbage. And now you're probably like, what the heck is a microdrive? Well, this is Clive Sinclair's brain going a little crazy again. It was a magnetic tape data storage system launched in 1983 by Sinclair Research, specifically for the Spectrum. It was proposed as a faster loading alternative to the cassette, and cheaper than a floppy disk. But they were never very good, and did not actually sell super well. They had really bad reliability, and they were often a lot slower than the alternatives. But Sinclair truly believed in his baby and defended it against all opposition. So much so that while the microdrive unit for the Spectrum had been an optional upgrade, you didn't have to buy that, so it wasn't really a big deal. In the QL's case, it was built into the device from the get-go. That's how it handled its data transfers natively through the microdrives. But basically nobody used the microdrives. It was proprietary to Sinclair, and that made them a lot less appealing to people even if they worked. And they didn't, at first. They were fixed, but the damage had been done. Plus, the timing of the QL's launch was really bad, because the target market, businessmen, had largely become reliant and embedded in the IBM PC platform. That's what they wanted, and the QL was not an IBM clone, it was its own thing, and most business people didn't want to stop using their IBM PCs for something that seemed a lot worse in a lot of ways. Even the keyboard, which looks like an upgrade compared to the previous entries, I mean, okay, it was better, but it was still considered not very good. But, you say, it's more capable. Maybe some of the ZX Spectrum owners want to upgrade. Yeah? Most of them didn't, though. Most were very loyal to their Spectrums. The QL was much more expensive from the get-go, and for the price, you weren't really getting that much of an upgrade. Mostly because the Spectrum just had more games. Yes, the QL could play nicer-looking games, I suppose, but it only had about 70 games ever available for it. The Spectrum had over 4,700. You see the difference here? It was a complete mess, and even sales for the upgraded Spectrums weren't really doing so hot. Granted, in some cases, honestly, I don't even know what they were thinking. For example, the ZX Spectrum Plus was just a ZX Spectrum, like literally the same, but with a keyboard that was closer to the QL, so a little bit better. They expected this to sell like hotcakes, just like the first Spectrum. But as it turns out, most didn't really feel like spending the extra money on what was a machine they already had, but with a slightly less obnoxious keyboard. Like, listen, they're not gonna do that. And they didn't. Retailers had stocked the machine in very large numbers in expectation of good Christmas sales in 1984, but it didn't sell hardly at all, and Sinclair Research's income from orders dipped off sharply in January. The ZX Spectrum 128 was an actual enhanced Spectrum, but that was launched in Spain in September of 1985, as the development had been funded by the Spanish distributor Investronica. Despite the 128 being a legitimate upgrade, the UK launch was delayed until in '86 because retailers still had large unsold stocks of the previous model and didn't want to invest in something new that they didn't think was going to sell. On top of the QL debacle, and the fact that Spectrum sales had kind of fallen off a little bit, most of their alternate products also weren't doing good. They invested a lot of time and money into an FM wristwatch radio, which never even entered production, as well as something called the TV-80, which was a flat-screen pocket TV. It failed miserably in the market. Plus, Sinclair got a bit distracted with the whole C5 thing. Remember the electric vehicle? Did a whole video about that? Yeah, that didn't go well either. And while he did have the good sense to do that under a separate company, the problem was, with all of Sinclair's consistent failures during about this time, basically everything since the Spectrum, investors started losing confidence in him. They just didn't think he was thinking from a business perspective, and to be frank, he probably wasn't. Sir Clive Sinclair was not really a businessman. He founded businesses, he founded companies, but at his core, he was an inventor, and he wanted to make cool things. And he did that, but not every cool thing is necessarily a marketable thing. Sinclair ultimately only cared about finishing whatever his mind tasked him with doing. Even if at the end of the day he never sold any of what he made, he had still made the thing, and it was a neat thing. but not every neat thing is something everyone wants to buy, and that was kind of the issue. He wasn't focused on making something that was marketable necessarily, he was focused on making stuff that he wanted to make. And I can't fault him for that, but that logic isn't guaranteed to net you financial success, you know? By 1985, they were looking into having a public offering of shares in order to generate much-needed capital, but they were never really able to do that. They continued falling off as the 80s wore on, and eventually, in 1986, they decided to straight up sell their entire computer product range, as well as the Sinclair brand name, to Amstrad for £5 million. Amstrad are their own story. If you're British, you know who they are. I can almost guarantee that that is the case. I won't really get into that, but they did go on to market different versions of the Spectrum for a few more years, and this sale didn't include the company itself, only the name and products. That meant that Sir Clive was able to keep his Sinclair Research company and focus on what he liked to do, which was invent. As a result, it was basically reduced to an R&D business, as well as a holding company, for a few shareholdings in some other ventures. And technically speaking, the company did continue to exist through the 90s and the 2000s, just a complete empty husk of what it once was. Well, mostly because it was just Sir Clive. By 1997, the entire staff had been reduced to him. Just him. Everyone else had left. And it mostly served as a vehicle for Sir Clive to just continue inventing. Not everything he made was a complete failure, but a lot of things weren't very good either. He invented the Zyke, an electric bicycle. It was neat, but also failed miserably, just like the C5 did. And in 2006, he released the A-Bike, which was a folding bicycle. A very tiny thing, but also very neat. And Sir Clive was good at that. Good at neat stuff. Maybe not necessarily marketable, but neat stuff. He worked on a lot of other projects, most of which didn't ever hit the market in any real way. And eventually, well, we all get old. On September 16th, 2021, Sinclair sadly passed away in London, following an illness that was related to cancer that he had been diagnosed with for over a decade. He was 81 at the time. He's still fondly remembered for his contributions, as he was a brilliant guy. Yeah, not everything he did was necessarily marketable, but some of it was, and even the stuff that wasn't was still pretty cool. The Spectrum, in particular, still to this day receives a ton of attention, with re-releases and rebadgings of the old technology. There was the ZX Spectrum Vega, a handheld TV game. The makers of that, Retro Computers Limited, would go on to announce the ZX Spectrum Vega Plus, which was going to be a handheld Spectrum. And that is a freaking story! No, you don't understand. It was so bad. It was everything. That is such a long tale of disasters and repeated failures. Miserable, horrible failures. It was awful. But the point is that there's still a ton of people interested in the Spectrum. Indeed, a different company called Retro Games announced that they are going to be releasing a recreation of the ZX Spectrum simply called The Spectrum. I hate it when they do stuff like that. But it's going to include 48 built-in games, a save game option, a rewind mode, and pre-owned titles load up. That's set to be released in, well, about a week, actually. Now, seriously, November 22nd, 2024. You see, people love the Spectrum, and we can all thank Sir Clive for that. He and his team put together one of the most influential computers of all time. And yes, perhaps the company didn't rise to the success of others, but no one can take away the legacy that is the ZX Spectrum and Sinclair Research. And with that, a special thank you to all my underwater train finders, Some Dude 267, Benjamin Owens, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Jack Carson's Road Videos, Lord Off 444, Isurfer 1405, Charles Kwiatkowski, Matt Weaver, Tom Redline, Adams Productions 8104, Wheeljack 8401, Rescues Greyhounds, The Baxter, Caleb Crosswhite, Josh Johnson, Caleb Rainwaters, Prez Drenton, Master of None, Travis Alinsky, JBL Explorers, Tommy Rossini, Ben McCullough, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Mark Holding, Mr. Terevel, Hayden DeGrow, Bad Train Puns Are Best, Kurt Forkum, Harry, Drew Debris, George Kenny, Kevin Wood, Hendrick Motorsports Fan 5, Hannah Bird, Duraushi, A Person 723, William Nemo, Dr. Racer78, Shimasu, Metal for Life Guy, Andrew Bowen, Crimson Rose, Ryan Wehofer, Zintac M, Boss K, Orange Glass, Andy, Ohio Trucker 1, Windy City Rails, John Videola, Extra Special J, Bob Condirk, Jared Brussel, Levi Anderson, Dara Williams, DE Ultra, Connor Hahn, AJNH86, Brian Philly, DFL Church, Murder Drones Doll, Nathaniel Brown, Robert Baldessari, Liam Wright, Mr. Sleepy, AET Museum, Jonathan Coco, NJ1969, Zendog, Rashad Austin, and of course, my dad. Till next time, this is Darkness and a Bidwell of Fun. Farewell.